Welcome back to another episode of the Casey Campbell Podcast. Casey Campbell with you, of course. We are pleased to be joined by someone that hasn't appeared on this channel in a while, but might as well, since it's the holidays, might as well. This is my Christmas present to all of you. Brock Beard is here, of course, from lastcar.com, and of course, a fellow YouTuber. Brock, how are you?
Doing great. And yeah, Merry Christmas to you, Casey, and to your viewers as well.
Yeah. So let's talk about, of course, you're in the process of making 500 days, of course, the story of the lost storylines of the 2001 Daytona 500. I just got done watching the first part. If you haven't seen the first part, we'll talk about some of the things that are in it. Obviously, go watch it if you haven't. But overall, what made this project come about? Like, what made you want to do this?
Well, it was a confluence of a couple different things. The first more professionally was the Field Filler series has been very popular. I was working on the Hermie Sadler episode, took quite a while. That was posted way back in February. I was hoping to get an interview with him. Now, apparently, what he's doing like a state senatorial bid, so he's been even harder to reach. So I just kind of went with what I had. I was going to do the same approach with Stanton Barrett's episode, which is going to be the next one. And then he's even busier than Hermie is, and then ultimately had some notes on the script that I sent him, so that had to be kind of pushed back. So in between all of this, I was like, well, okay, gonna have to do another project here, and it's gonna have to be something pretty big, because these other videos have already been delayed as much as we had. Luckily, we had some other good ones over the summer. The Arrington video did well, and so forth. But yeah, I kind of went back to the well that I've kind of focused on the channel a lot, which has been kind of the 2000 season. I've done 3 before February. I did the Johnny Benson video, Darrell Waltrip's retirement tour. It's a season that I didn't realize had such a central role in my memory, but it absolutely was. There's so many things that have happened, and there's so much that, even though I feel like I covered a lot of ground in all those videos, there's so much more. And we were kind of talking about this before the show tonight, that happened with all the other teams.
Yeah.
This is a time when you didn't have just 36 chartered teams. You had 45, 50 plus, and then just other teams that were trying to kind of break their way in to even make a 43 car field. And I thought, well, that would be interesting. So I kind of wanted to do just silly season. Consulted Jayski's records, for example, and I had some notes that it was going to be for a future project. And I was like, well, that's kind of narrow. Let's kind of widen it to just everybody. And that ended up taking quite a while. This was April at that point, and basically ever since then, it just kind of grew and grew, and it was going to just be this first part that was seen. And again, if your viewers haven't seen it, it is just on the silly season from basically the end of 1999 to right before Speed Week started in February 2001. And that was going to be the only video. But then it's like, well, I can't really stop there because there's other stuff the stories continue to develop during Speed Weeks. And then, of course, we can't do that without talking about the 500 itself, as difficult as that is. So it became a 3-part project. And that first part of that is what just premiered.
Yeah. So, and obviously, this is full context. Maybe you only watch this if you have watched video, because I'm going to spoil a bunch of things that happened. Well, obviously, you don't have to watch the video. You can go look up things that have happened in that season. But entering in at the beginning of the video with 1999, the biggest announcement, the 500 days, was really off of, when Dodge first announced that they were going to be returning, and Ray Evernham was spearing up this big project. Evernham Motorsports resigns from Hendrick. And then it just kind of goes from there. And I don't think really people really understood how big that was, that Dodge was coming back.
Absolutely. And that's, I was watching, when I was having lunch earlier today, I was watching, the happy hour for Sears Point back in 1999. And when I was watching it, I kind of realized that there was a time period there where things didn't change too much in the sport. Like, I mean, there were new drivers that were coming in. I mean, certainly Tony Stewart that season was massive and everything. But the way the broadcast felt, the way the race played out, the way the practice played out, there was a familiarity to everything there. And Ray Evernham was certainly a part of that. Ray Evernham and Jeff Gordon, of course, they went on and won Sears Point again that weekend. But when Ray Evernham left, when this happened, just later that 99 season, as you mentioned, it was huge. And at the time when he left, nobody knew what had happened. Like we knew he wasn't fired. He had left voluntarily, but there wasn't a question about what exactly he was doing. And the mystery kind of developed through that time. I mean, it was only a couple weeks until the Dodge announcement. You'll see this in the video. And then it's like, oh my gosh, he's gonna do that. And then we hadn't had a new manufacturer join the sport in some time, even though Mopar had a long presence in the sport before that. But the excitement built up to that, and what was so strange about it, and I kind of expressed this a little bit in the video, is it almost made the 2000 season secondary because everybody was already looking ahead to 2001, and maybe that had a role in why the safety debate was treated so secondarily that year too. I think and that's kind of the way I approach it in that video. The passing, the untimely deaths of Adam Petty, Kenny Irwin Jr., and Tony Roper are in there, but they're treated almost very dismissively, and that's intentional because that's the way it was. These things were big that happened there, but there was so much going on in the background there, and this momentum towards it that I really wanted to kind of capture that tone, especially since 3 Before February already really kind of details that better. I didn't want to repeat too much of that material, but definitely show where they fit in the timeline. I thought that was critical.
But it
Um,
also,
yeah,
go ahead, Brown. But also
no, that's it.
another one of the biggest things that came through the 2000 year was this was the last year of, for a lot of people, a lot of networks that were around when NASCAR kind of first started, and also it was the and we didn't know this at the time, but it was the last year for a lot of broadcasters in the sport as well.
Yes, yes, and that's very critical. The way that that season played out, and I mentioned this at the beginning. It's like you think it's just gonna be about Darrell Waltrip retiring, but then it's like, no, it's like not just him. This is a whole era that is coming to an end. I mean, and again, I talked at the beginning of the show here about the familiarity of like an ESPN broadcast in 1999 kind of felt more or less like one from 1994. Graphics are a little bit newer, but they approach things kind of the same, and that was kind of the familiarity to it. I think a lot of older fans really respond to that. But now all of a sudden this is completely turned upside down, and you got Fox and NBC are going to be coming in. Nobody knows even who is going to be broadcasting those. I mean, that kind of came up along the way. But it was very, I mean, a lot of changes that have happened in the sport. The sport's always been changing. It's not to say that this was the same since 1949. Obviously, it wasn't. But it's very rare that a massive change like that happens like intentionally. Sometimes it's like accidentally, like a new guy comes in and like a Dale Earnhardt that just completely turns everything upside down, or a Darrell Waltrip. But this was something that was deliberately happening, and everybody just want to know what was happening. But it was a whole year ahead, and the broadcast was very much a part of that.
Yeah, I mean ESPN, we didn't know this, but this was the last year for guys like, Ken Squire, Ned Jarrett, Buddy Baker,
Yep.
like Gold on television. Obviously, he still continued with MRN in later years. Bob Jenkins, another one. Obviously, Benny Parsons still was around, but a lot of things like the old TNN, which I believe is now True TV, um, and then also CBS. Of course, they didn't do many races in those days, but obviously it's like, it was iconic, like CBS Sports is to a lot of sports, like the NFL, golf, college basketball. In those days, it was iconic to have the Daytona 500 on there. And then ABC, obviously ABC and ESPN came back, but at that time, we really didn't know what was going to happen and how long that TV deal was. But just really how big were a lot of those partners, like the ABCs, the CBSs, and also TBS too.
Oh, it was huge. It's huge, and I think for I started following a sport in 1991, and I was about 8 or 9 years old at the time, and so I was in high school when this transition happened, senior in high school, and excuse me, it was like really, um, it was bizarre because for me, one thing I always liked about the sport is that there were a lot of the figures were around well before I ever got into the sport. And that includes, yeah, the broad, like you mentioned, Ken Squire, Bob Jenkins, Eli Gold. They've been around for a long time. And the drivers had, and there was a lot of, things. But I mean, like I kind of touched on there earlier, I mean, change has always been an aspect of the sport. We hear so much about that today. But it's not a recent phenomenon. I mean, there's always been, new teams that come in, new team owners, but sometimes it's never at a constant rate. It's sometimes it happens really quick, sometimes it happens really slow, sometimes it stagnates for a couple years. But this was a period, I think, where on multiple trajectories on the like it touched on there, yeah, the broadcast direction, the sponsorship direction, the new team involvement, manufacturer Dodge coming in, everything was kind of building at the same time, right at like the absolute peak of the sport. And that's an aspect I think of this video that I really wanted to hammer on, because obviously to a newer fan, the 2001 Daytona 500 and everything surrounded is just remembered for Dale Earnhardt. And not saying that it shouldn't, absolutely. But and that's why the title of it is Lost Storylines, because yes, all the it was before that happened, a race like any other race, and it had things that people were watching coming into it. But obviously, right when that accident happened, none of that mattered. And I think there was a long time in the sport where people had to kind of figure out what those storylines were, and some of them were probably just forgotten altogether. And that's what I really wanted to kind of capture in this, because there was so much excitement. I don't mean this disrespectfully to Earnhardt at all. And in fact, he plays in part two. He plays a massive role in this here. I mean, the broadcast partners were very right to bring as much attention to him as possible. And of course, nobody knowing what was going to happen. I think that's going to be very eye opening for younger fans. I've been very interested already in the response from a lot of younger fans just from this first part.
Yeah, I think as much younger people like the documentaries and stuff, but I also want to hit on, you mentioned the sponsorship stuff, and there was so much stuff that was going on there too. There's a couple particular teams I want to ask you about in a minute, but I think the ones that a lot of the Ford teams, like Roush Racing lost a ton of sponsors in that video. Ford Quality Care, that was on Dale Jarrett's car for so many years. It was a big deal that obviously now UPS coming in there and started sponsoring them in 2001. I know they kind of put the associate sponsors on there in like 2000, and just seeing that. And then the whole thing with Valvoline as well. It's like, being so many, with Mark Martin for so many years, obviously they would stick around in the sport. And then, shifting sponsors around, of course, the Pfizer company, of course, who owns Viagra and all that, and just coming into that team. And then, and then John Deere, STP, of course, that was, I believe the longest tenured sponsor. And I know they've since come back a couple times past 2000. And I think in 2021, I believe they just celebrated their 50th year associated with Richard Petty. So yeah, and just kind of touch on that a little bit, because there was so much that happened, especially with sponsorships.
It really was, and that is absolutely critical. I think the new TV contract and how much money was at play with this new Fox NBC deal, that can't be understated. And I think a lot of companies that maybe had no interest in racing, or maybe were just kind of thinking about it in the late '90s, were really jumping into it at that point. And yeah, I mean, it's absolutely amazing. I mean, you have some legacy sponsors that stayed in there. I mean, you got your Goodwrench, your Tide, and McDonald's and so forth. But yeah, I mean, these new partners, like you mentioned with UPS, I mean, they bring what, I think it was $15 million in there to just oust, the quality care sponsorship, and just, one of the most iconic paint schemes for those 5 or 6 years, winning 2 of his 3 Daytona 500s in that car. Things that were just unimaginable. It's like, and again, I don't want to, it sounds like I'm exaggerating, especially I'm sure to younger fans. But this was huge. I mean, you had a lot of people that were just looking for the best ride that they could possibly get. And when you see it in part one, you see some drivers that are just absolutely weaving from one place to the next and seeing if they're going to be a fit here or there, and what sponsor they can get matched up. And the Roush Racing deal, I didn't do any interviews for this project, and that was again intentional, because I wanted this to be something that I wouldn't have to be beholden to trying to get interviews set up and delayed even further than it was. Maybe I'll do some follow up there to kind of contextualize it. But if I were to interview one project, I would have loved to understand from Roush's perspective what was going on with their sponsor issues that year, and the fact that 4 of their 5 cars lost their sponsors. They only got 2 back in exchange, and they had to shut down one of their cars. an astounding change for a program that was one of the top teams. Mark Martin had a career year just 2 years before that. Valvoline had tremendous exposure in the sport, and yet they're just all of a sudden like, nope, we're going to go over here, and it's like what? Like, I mean, these were massive changes to the sport, and the few teams that didn't really have those problems were very, very rare. Got guys. I mean, for some reason, the beer sponsors seem to be the most loyal of anybody. Your Coors Light with Marlin, Budweiser with Junior, Miller Lite with Rusty Wallace. They seem to be the ones that most likely stayed. But most of the other ones, they were like really exploring their options and what was going to be the best way to represent their brand.
The home improvement sponsors, I know, you mentioned, I know you mentioned a little bit about Home Depot, but they ended up staying with Tony Stewart for a while.
Yep.
Of course, Lowe's, with the very interesting path there, with RCR, and then they decided to obviously jump over to Hendrick obviously later on,
Yep.
but it was just interesting to see that. But they just to understand, and of course also the new paint schemes. Of course, Rusty gets a new paint scheme. The silver. This is the first year of the Silver Bullet. Of course, Jeff Gordon also runs. This was the first year that the new Hot Look paint scheme kind of really showed out there. But what all these teams and sponsorships, there's one that really kind of sticked out to me, and that was and that you talked about this toward the last part of the video, Galaxy Motorsports. I think that's a team that a lot of people really kind of don't understand. And this was and at the end of that was really the end of what we didn't know, but it was the end of Ollie Dallenbach's Cup career. Kind of explain that for people that might not know Galaxy Motorsports.
Certainly. The 75 team was originally the same. You hear about Raymock Enterprises. You hear about, I think they were featured on, I think it was Bob Rahilly that was featured on, or I think it was Butch Mock. It was one of their partners was featured on the Scene Vault podcast not long ago. And that was one of the most successful single car teams in the 80s. It wasn't one of the top teams, but they were solid. They were always a factor. Neil Bonnet was very good with them. And then they had a great super speedway program. Even in 1992, when they didn't have a sponsor, Dick Trickle got a top 5 in the Daytona 500. Could have had an even better run that year, which is one of the most unheralded runs by an unsponsored car in recent memory. But the eventually, I believe Ray Hilly stepped out, so it was just Butch Mock involved in it in the mid '90s. They got Remington as a sponsor. They got Morgan Shepherd and Ted Musgrave later as drivers. And then late in the '99 season, Mock was looking to get out of the sport as well and sold the team to Darwin Ort. Interesting name there as a name that probably a lot of people aren't aware of either, but apparently, also was involved in Busch Series teams at the time. Actually, he came up during the Stanton Barrett research. So he was not an outsider at all. He was really already kind of trying to grow that program with Channel Lock as a sponsor. Came into this Cup program and wanted to kind of keep it going. They picked up a lot of sponsors that were kind of left over from other teams. The Cartoon Network Turner Motorsports thing that was left over from Hendrick when Kodiak came over there, kind of came over on board. Red Cell Batteries, I believe they were a sponsor of another team as well, and they jumped on. And they got a couple other piecemeal sponsors along the way to kind of get things together. But the problem is that, I mean, I guess it really wasn't carrying over to the next year. Some of those partners kind of tapered off towards the end of the 2000 season, and they got Rotozip Power Tools, but they're wavering, and Red Cell is looking at Brett Bodine's team. But all the while, the team owner is saying, look, we can maybe get Pizza Hut on this car, and that'll be great. And that'll solve all our problems. And Wally, you stay with us. And Wally was very supportive of it and saying, okay, well, I'm going to turn down this ride and that ride. One of those, apparently was, let's see, I'm trying to remember correctly. I think he was offered the third Childress ride.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was that. But again, just like, okay, well, no, I'm staying with this team and we're going to make this happen. And only to find that they weren't able to get sponsors over the offseason. The Pizza Hut thing never happened. The team never, I don't think Darwin Ort ever entered another Cup car, at least certainly not in the 2000 season. And yeah, he was just left. He was left to his legal remedies. He did sue Ort for, non-performance of the contract. But yeah, I mean, it just shows. I mean, it used to be from one silly season to the next, you would every once in a while have like not enough chairs and you'd have a driver or two that was just out of a ride and maybe they'd pick up something along the way. But really, Wally only made like one other cup start that year as a relief driver. And that was it. I know he made some Xfinity starts later on, but yeah, I mean, I'm sure when it was coming down to the end of the 2000 season, he didn't think that in 7 months he'd be a broadcaster and he'd just be out of it altogether. But that was unfortunately another consequence of the popularity of the sport, is that it could only there were some constraints that could conceivably knock a veteran out for no reason at all. It wasn't injured or anything like that. Nothing controversial happened. It just didn't work out.
Yeah. And there were a lot of other things that kind of proceed from that alone. Just more free agent moves from that thing, like kind of prolonged throughout the video, like the Matei Motorsports, when before Jim Smith kind of came in there, before it became Ultra Motorsports. Michael Waltrip kind of wavering to see if he was actually, eventually he ended up in the 15 at DEI with Napa, but it was a while before they kind of experienced where that was going to go or where that was going to lead. So out of all that, and also really, this is just anything, what do you think was the biggest thing, that storyline, that when you did this, it's like, oh yeah, this happened, and it was prolonged throughout the video, like also the 4 car.
Yep, exactly. I got a little spoiler alert on this shirt here too of where that ended up. But yeah, I think that was the surprising thing, and that's why I really wanted to do it chronologically. I was debating about whether to do it by driver, or maybe feature them here and there while talking about 2001, but that was going to be way too hard to follow. And I really wanted to do the graphics to kind of make it much easier to follow, to say, okay, now we're talking about this team, now we're talking about this team. And sometimes that could get confusing because there's so much back and forth. That's why I put the entry list up earlier today, because I figured, okay, this is where everything ended up. But yeah, in terms of, to answer your question, there were definitely ones that went longer than others, certainly, and that was fascinating. The fact that Ganassi's 01 car,
Yeah.
and yes, Morgan McClure's number 4 and the Ultra Motorsports number 7 were settled very, very late in the silly season, almost to the extent of, like, within days before testing, or the start of speed weeks itself, very, very late in the going. And then other ones that were teased, but I thought the Michael Waltrip thing was fascinating, that it was mentioned in the spring, but Ty Norris is like, nah, we can't really expand to 3 cars. But all the while, and behind the scenes, we know from Michael Waltrip's side of the story too. It's like, look, they you remember from Blink of an Eye, when they were talking with the Napa folks, and they're wondering, like, wow, you think we can get Michael? Like, they're excited about it. This is all happening behind the scenes, but we didn't know till September. And it's like, oh heck yeah, we're signing him up. But even at that point, we didn't know what the car number was going to be. It wasn't even confirmed at that point. The fact that that was even later in the progression, at least core of the. And again, this is all from the. Again, I can't thank Jayski enough for keeping those old archives up. And that's what I really wanted to use. I mean, obviously, there's some stories. I know people brought a lot of attention to the Mo Nunn racing thing with Jimmy Vassar. I really kind of kept it about a pretty closed universe with just the J Ski rumors. But apparently, some of those other ones, changed different directions there. But that was one of them, and I was trying to really capture. But really trying to wonder how early both of those were even being discussed, because they were rumored pretty far back. I think those were probably 2 of the biggest ones, certainly consequentially into 2001.
Yeah, for sure. And I know you're coming up on I know we don't have a lot of time, but I just want to ask you this. What are we going to look forward to after you've seen part 1? Part 2, part 3, there's 2 more parts. It's going to debut. Part 2 is coming out next week. Don't obviously give it away, but just talk about what can people expect.
A good question. Yeah. So part 1, we started right from the end of 99, ends February, I believe February 7th, 2001, which is right before the start of Speed Week. So next week in part 2, we're going to only discuss Speed Weeks itself, and really the stock car portion of it. I know we've already talked about the 24 hours of Daytona briefly in this last episode. We're going to go ahead of that, and we're going to start with Fox beginning their coverage and understanding the tone of the broadcast and the stock car portion of that week. So all the preliminary events are going to be in part two. We're going to talk about not only the practice and qualifying sessions, the qualifying races, the 125s. We talk about the ARCA series, the Goodies Dash series, the Truck series, the Xfinity series, which was the Busch series back then. All those are going to be discussed in this. Some more than others, for time constraints here. I didn't want to make it a 4-hour episode, if I if I really wanted to. But yeah, and then and the major focus in part two is going to be on the Cup Series portion of it. Those parts are going to be much more in depth than some of the other series, but they're all going to be represented along the way with as much footage as possible. And big thanks to Dave W on YouTube, as well as Scott Allen Brown for his excellent render of the Daytona 500 itself. Both of those were massively helpful in this project and are definitely used in that. And then part three is going to be just the Daytona 500 itself, which is going to be everything on February 18th. Now, and this is a little bit of a spoiler, but I don't mind saying it because I know people are concerned about this. It's going to be right up to the last corner of the last lap, and then there's that. So, because obviously, what happens after that is a very, very different story. And so that's how I've kind of handled that. So, yeah, I'm going to be mentioning that in the live stream later tonight too. So, this will already be out by that point too. So that's kind of what those next two parts are. So, yeah, and it's going to be it'll be interesting. I'm very interested in people's response to it, and how all that how all that's received. Really, I've been overwhelmed with the response so far, and big thanks to everybody that's commented on the video and shared it. Brad Perez was in the comment section there. I mean, it was very exciting. So I'm very happy that the passion for the sports history, the good along with the bad, is just as much as ever. And I think it's important to understand those, to understand the current trajectory of the sport too. It's not saying that this is better, or this was more important, but I mean, certainly it's a critical time period in the sport. And I think from our discussion here, your viewers will certainly recognize that.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, Brock Beard, we'll let you go. Thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. And don't forget to catch the 500 lost storylines of the 2001 Daytona 500. Part two will premiere next week, and then I believe the week after for part three, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. Wednesday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. So the next two Wednesdays, December 28th is part two. January 4th is part three.
All right. Sounds good. Brock, thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Certainly. Thank you.